I never imagined I'd be sitting in my car outside my own son's wedding, clutching an envelope that could destroy his happiest day. The invitation I never received mocked me from the passenger seat. A pristine white card my neighbor had secretly photographed when it arrived at the wrong address. 55 years of memories flashed through my mind. James's first steps, his graduation, the day we buried his father. I'd given up everything to raise him alone, yet here I was, excluded from the most important moment of his life. Charlotte had orchestrated it perfectly, turning my only child against me over 2 years of subtle manipulation. But now, watching guests file into the church in their Sunday best, I held something that could change everything. Proof of her betrayal. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you, what would you do if protecting someone meant losing them forever? And tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose every mother dreams of her child's wedding day. For 28 years, I imagined standing beside James as he prepared to take his vows, helping him straighten his bow tie, just as I had done for his high school prom. Instead, I sat in my car across from St. Michael's Cathedral, watching other mothers fulfill that role while my heart splintered into 1,000 pieces. The morning had started like any other. I'd woken at dawn, a habit formed from decades of teaching high school English before my retirement 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent 30 years helping other people's children analyze great literature, while my own son had become a stranger. The morning light had filtered through my kitchen window as I made my usual cup of Earl Grey, trying to convince myself I wouldn't drive to the church. But here I was, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the manila envelope on the passenger seat feeling heavier than any burden I'd ever carried. Inside were the photographs Patricia had taken 2 weeks ago at the Harbor Hotel. Snapshots of Charlotte in an intimate embrace with Daniel Hayes, her married coworker. The same Daniel Hayes who, according to the wedding program I'd managed to obtain, was serving as one of James's groomsmen today. Life has a cruel way of teaching us its hardest lessons when we least expect them. If you had told me 3 years ago that I would be excluded from my only child's wedding, I would have laughed. James and I had always been more than just mother and son. We were best friends, confidants, survivors of a shared tragedy that had bound us together in ways few could understand. Thomas's death when James was just 3 had reshaped our entire world. I still remember that rainy Tuesday evening when the police officers appeared at our door, their faces grave, as they explained how my husband's car had hydroplaned on the highway. James had been too young to fully comprehend what was happening, but he'd sensed something was terribly wrong. He'd clung to my leg as I collapsed into a kitchen chair, my world crumbling around me. In the years that followed, James became my reason for everything. Every decision I made, every sacrifice I chose, was filtered through the lens of what would be best for him. I took the teaching position at Boston Latin School because it offered better benefits and would allow me to be home when he finished school. I turned down David Miller's marriage proposal when James was 12 because I sensed my son wasn't ready for that kind of change. I poured every ounce of love and energy I had into ensuring James never felt the absence of his father too keenly. Perhaps that was my first mistake, loving him too completely, too sacrificially. Dr. Morrison, my therapist of the past 18 months, suggests I may have inadvertently created an emotional dependency that made it easier for someone like Charlotte to drive a wedge between us. Sometimes, she'd said during one of our sessions, the tighter we hold on, the more desperately someone needs to break free. I watched another wave of guests enter the church, their laughter carrying across the street to where I sat in my sensible Honda Civic. The women wore pastel dresses and fascinator hats, the men in sharp suits with flowers in their lapels. Among them, I recognized Helen Winters, Charlotte's mother, her silver hair styled immaculately as she air-kissed her way up the church steps. The same Helen Winters who had looked me up and down at our first meeting 2 years ago, as if I were something unpleasant stuck to her Louboutin heel. That dinner at L'Espalier had been the beginning of the end, though I hadn't recognized it at the time. Charlotte had just moved in with James, and he'd insisted on a proper family dinner to celebrate. I'd worn my best dress, a navy blue cocktail number I'd bought for the school's retirement party, and even treated myself to a professional blowout. But from the moment Helen Winters swept into the restaurant, 15 minutes late and dripping in designer labels, I knew I was out of my league. "Oh, you're still teaching," she'd said when James proudly mentioned my career. "How noble. Charlotte's father and I always stressed the importance of ambition. That's why she's already a marketing executive at 32. The way she'd emphasized executive made my 30 years of shaping young minds feel somehow inadequate. James had shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Charlotte placed her hand over his with practiced sympathy. "Mom," she'd said, her voice honey-sweet, "not everyone measures success the same way. I'm sure Mrs. Sullivan's students adored her." The use of Mrs. Sullivan instead of Maggie, which she'd called me until then, wasn't lost on me. In one elegant move, she'd both defended and diminished me. Looking back, I can see how methodically Charlotte worked to reshape James's perception of me. It started with small things, suggesting that my daily phone calls to him were a bit much for a grown-up man, implying that my concern about their rapid relationship progression was controlling rather than caring. She would praise my cooking while subtly suggesting that perhaps I relied too heavily on comfort food rather than the trendy, healthy dishes she prepared. When James got the promotion at his architectural firm, Charlotte threw him a surprise party at their sleek downtown loft. I wasn't invited but found out about it through Facebook photos. When I asked James about it later, he'd seemed genuinely confused. "Oh, Mom, we kept it small. Just work friends." "You wouldn't have known. Anyone anyway. The James I'd raised would never have celebrated anything without me." The changes in him became more pronounced after they moved in together. My Sunday dinner invitations were increasingly met with excuses about prior commitments or Charlotte's meal prep schedule. When he did visit, he seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly and leaving early. Charlotte had him on some sort of paleo diet, and suddenly the lasagna he'd grown up loving was politely declined because it didn't fit their lifestyle choices. I tried to adapt, to show I could change too. I learned to make grain-free muffins and dairy-free smoothies. I read the self-help books Charlotte was always referencing and attempted to speak their language of boundaries and personal growth. But somehow, every effort I made was interpreted as another example of my inability to let go. The breaking point came during last year's Thanksgiving. I'd hosted every holiday since Thomas died, maintaining traditions that connected James to his father's memory. But Charlotte had announced they would be spending it with her family in their Beacon Hill brownstone instead. When I suggested we could do both, early dinner with her family, dessert with me, she'd looked at James with practiced concern. "Honey," she'd said, "remember what Dr. Foster said about establishing healthy boundaries? Your mother needs to understand that we're building our own traditions now." Dr. Foster, the couple's therapist I later learned, Charlotte had insisted they see, who had apparently diagnosed me as enmeshed without ever meeting me. James hadn't, avoided my eyes as he delivered the final blow. "Mom, maybe it would be better if we took a break from the holidays this year. Give everyone some space." The way he'd said it, using Charlotte's therapeutic vocabulary, made my heart crack. This wasn't my son speaking. These weren't his words or thoughts. After that, the distance between us became a chasm. My calls went to voicemail more often than not. My texts received brief, polite responses hours or days later. When I ran into James at our local coffee shop in February, he'd seemed almost frightened to be seen with me, rushing through awkward small talk before hurrying away. The next day, I received a lengthy email from Charlotte expressing concern about my accidental run-in with James, suggesting it might be better if I found a different coffee shop to frequent. The engagement announcement came via Instagram, a perfectly staged photo of Charlotte showing off her massive diamond ring, while James kissed her cheek against the backdrop of the public garden. The caption read, "When you know, you know. Blessed, future Mrs. James Sullivan." I learned later that Helen Winters had helped James select the ring, a family heirloom reset to Charlotte's specifications. The emerald and diamond ring Thomas had given me, which I'd always assumed would one day belong to James's wife, remained in my jewelry box. I tried reaching out, leaving a voicemail congratulating them and offering to help with wedding preparations. Charlotte responded with a text thanking me for my kind wishes, but explaining that her mother had everything under control. When I pressed James about being involved, he'd sighed that familiar Charlotte-induced sigh. "Mom, please don't make this difficult. Charlotte has a very specific vision for the wedding." That specific vision, it turned out, didn't include me at all. The months leading up to the wedding were a blur of social media posts showing cake, tastings, venue tours, and dress fittings, all orchestrated by Helen Winters and her country club circle. Charlotte's Instagram stories featured mother-daughter wedding planning moments that felt like deliberate daggers to my heart. Even James's sister-in-law, married to his cousin on Thomas's side, was included in the bridal party while I remained on the outside, looking in. It was Patricia who first noticed something wasn't right with Charlotte. My best friend since college, Pat had always possessed an uncanny ability to read people. "There's something off about that girl," she'd said months ago over our weekly coffee date. "The way she performs everything, like she's always aware of the camera, even when there isn't one." Pat worked as a legal secretary at a downtown firm near the Harbor Hotel, where she often took her lunch breaks in the atrium. That's where she first spotted Charlotte and Daniel Hayes 2 months ago, sharing what appeared to be an intimate lunch. "Could have been innocent," Pat had said, "but something about their body language set off alarm bells." She'd started paying attention after that, noting the times she saw them together, the way they moved in sync, the lingering touches that spoke of familiarity beyond professional boundaries. Then, 2 weeks ago, she'd captured the photographs that now sat in my car. Charlotte and Daniel locked in an embrace in the hotel's side garden, his wedding ring clearly visible as his hands cupped her face. I'd wrestled with the knowledge ever since. Part of me wanted to rush to James immediately to protect him from the pain of betrayal, but Charlotte had spent 2 years painting me as the villain in their story. The overbearing mother who couldn't let go, who invented problems because she couldn't stand seeing her son happy. Would he even believe me? Or would this be the final proof of everything Charlotte had convinced him I was? The church bells began to chime, signaling 30 minutes until the ceremony. I watched as the last few guests hurried up the steps, programs clutched in their hands. Through the open doors, I could see the flowers, white roses and peonies cascading from every surface, Exactly the arrangement I'd once mentioned, hoping to have at James's wedding, when he was still my James. My phone buzzed with a text from Pat. "Are you there? Don't do anything rash. Maybe we should talk first." She'd been worried about me since I'd told her my plan to come here today. "Think it through," she'd warned. "Once you do this, there's no going back." But as I sat there, watching my son's wedding unfold without me, I realized there was already no going back. The relationship I'd had with James, the bond I'd thought unbreakable, had already been systematically dismantled. The only question remaining was whether I could live with myself if I stayed silent. Knowing what I knew, I thought about Thomas, about what he would do in my position. He'd always believed in hard truths over comfortable lies. "The right thing and the easy thing are rarely the same," he used to say. In our 15 years together, he'd never once taken the easy path when integrity was at stake. The envelope seemed to pulse on the seat beside me, like a living thing demanding attention. Inside were not just photographs of Charlotte's betrayal, but copies of text messages Pat had helped me obtain, hotel receipts, and a detailed timeline of Charlotte and Daniel's encounters over the past 6 months. It was enough evidence to be irrefutable, even to someone as thoroughly manipulated as James had been. A movement at the church entrance caught my eye. Daniel Hayes had arrived, straightening his groomsman's boutonniere as he jogged up the steps. The same hands that had been tangled in Charlotte's hair 2 weeks ago were about to help my son prepare for his wedding. The same man who had been sleeping with the bride would stand beside the groom and smile for photographs. The unfairness of it all hit me with physical force. James deserved to know the truth, deserved the chance to make an informed decision about his future. Even if he hated me for being the messenger, even if this permanently severed whatever fragile thread still connected us, I had to try. I owed him that much as his mother. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The face that looked back was tired but determined. I'd styled my silver-streaked hair carefully this morning, applied makeup with a steady hand, chosen a simple but elegant blue dress that Charlotte would have deemed appropriate for a wedding guest. If I was going to blow up my son's wedding, I would at least look dignified doing it. Taking a deep breath, I gathered the envelope and my courage. The weight of 28 years of motherhood pressed down on my shoulders as I opened the car door. The spring air was thick with the scent of flowers and the sound of organ music drifting from the church. In less than 30 minutes, my son would make the biggest mistake of his life, unless I found the strength to stop it. As I crossed the street toward St. Michael's, my heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown, I remembered something. Else Thomas used to say, "Love isn't about making people happy. It's about making them better." I could only pray that someday James would understand that everything I was about to do came from a place of love. The church steps loomed before me, each one representing a choice that had led to this moment. Behind those heavy wooden doors, my son's future hung in the balance, and I, the uninvited mother of the groom, held the truth that could change everything. The heavy wooden doors of St. Michael's Cathedral felt like a physical manifestation of the barrier between my son and me. As I pulled them open, the familiar scent of incense and old wood wrapped around me like a forgotten memory. James had been baptized here, had served as an altar boy through his teenage years. Now, I was entering as an intruder, clutching evidence that would shatter the perfect day Charlotte had orchestrated. The foyer was mercifully empty, though voices echoed from various rooms off the main sanctuary. To my left, I could hear the distinctive sound of Helen Winters directing the photographer with military precision. To my right, male laughter spilled from what I assumed was the groom's preparation room. My heart clenched at the sound of James's voice among them, still so familiar despite our estrangement. I hesitated, my hand tightening around the envelope. The logical part of my brain screamed that I should wait until after the ceremony, that there had to be a better way to handle this. But the mother in me knew that every minute I delayed was another minute closer to my son legally binding himself to a lie. A door opened down the hall, and I quickly stepped behind a massive floral arrangement. Charlotte's sister Emma emerged, carrying a garment bag and muttering about last-minute alterations. She passed within inches of my hiding spot, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air. Once she disappeared up the stairs, I took a deep breath and made my decision. The door to the bride's room was slightly ajar, golden light spilling onto the dark wooden floor. I could hear Charlotte's voice inside, that practiced tone of sweet authority she'd perfected over the years. No, the veil needs to be higher. Mom, can you please tell them how we discussed it? I can't deal with this right now. I squared my shoulders and pushed the door open. The room fell silent as every head turned toward me. Charlotte stood in the center, a vision in white lace and silk, her face a perfect mask of bridal serenity that cracked for just a moment when she saw me. Helen Winters, who had been fussing with the veil, straightened like a guard dog sensing a threat. Mrs. Sullivan. Charlotte recovered quickly, her voice dripping with practiced concern. I don't think you're supposed to be here. Did someone give you the wrong impression about the guest list? Hello, Charlotte. I kept my voice steady, years of classroom management coming in handy. You look beautiful, though I imagine Daniel Hayes would say you looked even more beautiful 2 weeks ago at the Harbor Hotel. The color drained from her face so quickly that her makeup seemed to float like a mask. Helen stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands clenched into fists. How dare you come here and make accusations on my daughter's wedding day? Security! By all means, call security, I replied, opening the envelope. I'm sure they'd be very interested in these photographs. As would James, don't you think? Charlotte's bridesmaids huddled together like a flock of startled birds in their pale pink dresses, while the makeup artist and hairdresser suddenly became very interested in their equipment. Only Patricia, Charlotte's maid of honor, and Daniel's wife of 12 years, seemed unsurprised. Her eyes met mine with a mixture of resignation and relief, and I realized with a start that she had known. Of course she had known. Whatever you are, think you have. Charlotte's voice had lost its sweetness, replaced by something cold and sharp. It won't work. James won't believe you. You're just proving everything I've told him about you. I pulled out the first photograph. Charlotte and Daniel entwined in the hotel garden, her engagement ring glinting in the sunlight as her fingers gripped his hair. Are you sure about that? Because this seems pretty clear to me, as do the hotel receipts, the text messages, the timeline my friend put together. Did you really think no one would notice your little afternoon meetings? Helen made a grab for the envelope, but years of confiscating notes in class had given me quick reflexes. I stepped back, keeping the evidence safely out of reach. Don't worry, I have copies. Multiple copies, in fact. Some already in very safe places. What do you want? Charlotte's question came out as a hiss, her perfect bride facade crumbling around the edges. Money? Is that it? Are you really so desperate to ruin your son's happiness that you'd resort to blackmail? The accusation stung, but I held my ground. What I want is for my son not to marry someone who's been cheating on him for months. What I want is for him to know the truth before he makes a mistake he'll spend years trying to undo. Mom. James's voice from the doorway hit me like a physical blow. I turned to find him standing there in his tuxedo, looking so much like his father on our wedding day that my heart nearly stopped. His face registered confusion, then alarm as he took in the scene before him. "What are you doing here? You weren't invited." "James, honey." Charlotte's voice immediately returned to its sugary register as she moved toward him, careful to keep her dress out of his sight. "Your mother is having one of her episodes. She's trying to ruin our wedding because she can't stand the thought of letting you go." But James's eyes were fixed on the photograph in my hand, which I'd turned toward him without thinking. Even from where he stood, the image was clear enough. I watched as recognition dawned in his eyes. The familiar garden where he often had lunch meetings, the distinctive red hair he'd fallen in love with, the man he'd trusted enough to make a groomsman. "What is this?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, what are you doing?" "Showing you the truth," I said softly, holding out the envelope. "Before you make a commitment you can't easily undo. I know you probably hate me right now, and maybe you'll hate me forever for this, but you deserve to know who you're really marrying." Charlotte moved with the speed of desperation, trying to intercept the envelope. But James was faster. His hands shook as he pulled out the stack of evidence. Photographs, receipts, text message screenshots, all meticulously organized and dated, each piece another nail in the coffin of his perfect romance. "It's not what it looks like." Charlotte's voice had taken on a frantic edge. "She's manipulated those photos, created fake messages. You know how she is. How she's never accepted us, never accepted me. Baby, please, the guests are waiting. We can talk about this after the ceremony." But James wasn't listening. He was staring at a particular text message exchange, his face growing paler by the second. I recognized it. The one where Charlotte and Daniel had discussed their plans for, after the wedding, how they would eventually orchestrate a divorce that would leave Charlotte with half of James's assets and the freedom to finally be together. Openly. "Daniel?" James's voice cracked on the name. "My friend Daniel? The man I asked to stand beside me today?" As if summoned by his name, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his groomsman's boutonniere slightly askew. "Hey, we're ready to..." He trailed off as he took in the scene, his eyes widening as they landed on the evidence in James's hands. The next few moments seemed to happen in slow motion. James lunged at Daniel with a roar of pain and betrayal. Charlotte screamed. "Helen!" Winters began shouting about lawsuits and restraining orders. The bridesmaids scattered like startled pigeons, while Patricia stood rooted to the spot, tears streaming down her face. I watched as my son's perfect day imploded around him. My heart breaking even as I knew I'd done the right thing. Security finally arrived, drawn by the commotion, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back in its box. "Get out!" James's voice cut through the chaos as he turned to Charlotte, his face a mask of fury and hurt. "All of you, get out. The wedding's off." Charlotte made one last attempt, reaching for him with trembling hands. "James, please, let me explain. It's not what you think. I love you. I do. She's twisted everything because she's jealous of what we have." "What we have?" James laughed, a hollow sound that reminded me of the day we'd buried his father. "What we have is a lie. Every moment, every promise, every plan, all of it built on lies." He turned to Daniel, who was being held back by another groomsman. "And you, my friend. I trusted you with everything. My relationships, my business connections, my future. Was any of it real?" Daniel at least had the decency to look ashamed. "James, man, I'm sorry. It just happened. We never meant to..." "Never meant to what?" James's voice rose. Never meant to sleep with my fiancé. Never meant to plan how to take half my assets in a future divorce. Never meant for me to find out. Which part didn't you mean? The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, we could hear the murmur of guests, wondering why the ceremony hadn't started. The organist had begun playing another round of preliminary music, unaware that there would be no wedding march today. Helen Winters was the first to recover, her society training kicking in as she began damage control. Emma, start telling guests there's been a medical emergency. Patricia, help Charlotte out of that dress. We need to clear the church quickly and quietly. But James wasn't finished. He turned to me, his eyes full of emotions I couldn't quite read. How long have you known? 2 weeks, I answered honestly. Since Pat saw them at the hotel. I've spent every day since then trying to decide what to do. Whether to tell you. He nodded slowly, processing. And you chose to do it now, like this, in front of everyone. I chose to do it before it was too late, I said softly. Because I love you too much to watch you marry someone who doesn't deserve you, even if it meant you might hate me for it. Something flickered across his face. Pain, recognition, perhaps a shadow of the bond we'd once shared. But before he could respond, the door burst open again. This time it was the priest, Father Michael, who had baptized James and presided over Thomas's funeral. What is going on in here? He demanded, taking in the scene with growing alarm. The guests are getting restless, and I just heard the most disturbing rumors. James straightened his shoulders, and in that moment he looked so much like his father that my breath caught. Father, I apologize, but there won't be a wedding today, or ever. He turned to the shocked faces around him. I suggest everyone start making their calls and sending their apologies. I have some things to say to my former fiancé and former friend in private. The room began to clear, people filing out in various states of shock and distress. Helen Winters paused at the door, fixing me with a glare that could have frozen hell. You'll pay for this, she hissed. I'll make sure of it. I met her gaze steadily. The truth always costs something, but lies cost more. As the room emptied, I turned to go, but James's voice stopped me. Mom, wait. I turned back to find him, looking at me with the same expression he'd worn as a child after skinning his knee, hurt but seeking comfort. Would you stay? Please? I nodded, my heart simultaneously breaking and healing. Whatever happened next, whatever words would be exchanged between my son and the woman who had betrayed him, I would be there, not to gloat or interfere, but to be the mother I had always been, the one who held him through every pain, who celebrated every joy, who loved him enough to risk everything to protect him. The next hour was brutal. James listened as Charlotte tried to explain as Daniel attempted to apologize, as their carefully constructed deception unraveled thread by thread. I stood silently in the corner, witnessing my son's heartbreak and his strength emerge. When he finally asked them to leave, his voice was tired but resolute. Once we were alone, James sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The sound of guests departing filtered through the windows, along with confused murmurs and the occasional flash of a phone camera. Tomorrow this would all be social media fodder. But right now, it was just a mother and son in the aftermath of destruction. I don't know whether to thank you or hate you, he said finally, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. You can do both, I replied gently. I can handle it. He laughed, a broken sound that turned into a sob. Without thinking, I moved to him, and suddenly I was holding my adult son as he cried, just as I had when he was small, and the world had hurt him. We stayed that way for a long time, the mother who had risked everything, and the son who had lost everything, finding our way back to each other in the ruins of what should have been his perfect day. Finally, James pulled back, wiping his eyes. How did you know? I mean, really know it wasn't just suspicion or jealousy or whatever Charlotte always accused you of. I told him everything about Pat's observations, the photographs, the investigation we'd done. As I spoke, I could see him processing not just Charlotte's betrayal, but the past 2 years of gaslighting and manipulation. She made me doubt everything, he said quietly. Every memory, every relationship, every instinct. She made me doubt, you most of all. That's what manipulators do, I replied, thinking of all the therapy sessions where I'd tried to understand what had happened to my relationship with my son. They isolate you from the people who can see through them. James stood and walked to the window, watching the last of his wedding guests depart. What do I do now? How do I face everyone? How do I start over? I joined him at the window, remembering another day long ago when I'd asked myself the same questions after losing Thomas. You do it one day at a time. You let yourself feel everything. The anger, the hurt, the relief, all of it. And you remember that you're not alone. He turned to me then, really looked at me for the first time in 2 years. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything, for doubting you, for pushing you away, for... I stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. You have nothing to apologize for. You were in love, and she took advantage of that. The only thing that matters now is that you know the truth before it was too late. Yeah, he sighed, looking around the room that should have been the starting point of his new life. I guess we should get out of here. Face the world. As we walked out of St. Michael's together, I couldn't help but think about how differently this day had turned out from what anyone had expected. The flowers would wilt, the cake would go uneaten, the carefully planned celebrations would never happen. But something else had been born in their place, a second chance for a mother and son to rebuild what had been broken. Telling and preparing. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Outside, the spring air was still sweet with promise, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing, not for a wedding now, but perhaps for something just as important, the truth, finally set free. The week following the wedding that wasn't passed in a blur of damage control and emotional aftershocks, I brought James home with me that first night, unable to bear the thought of him returning to the apartment he'd shared with Charlotte. He slept in his old room, surrounded by high school trophies and faded photographs, while I lay awake listening to him, pace the floors like he used to do as a teenager wrestling with difficult decisions. The media circus was immediate and merciless. Someone, probably one of Charlotte's bridesmaids, had leaked the story to a local news blog, and it spread like wildfire. Jilted groom discovers fiancé's affair with best man on wedding day, read one headline. Mother of groom crashes, society wedding with explosive evidence, declared another. Helen Winters had apparently hired a PR firm to spin the narrative in Charlotte's favor, painting her as the victim of a vindictive, almost mother-in-law's jealous machinations. Don't read the comments, I advised James over breakfast that first morning, watching him scroll through his phone with increasingly tense shoulders. Nothing good ever comes from reading the comments. He looked up at me, dark circles under his eyes testament to his sleepless night. Did you know they're calling you the wedding warrior on Twitter? There's even a hashtag. I set a plate of scrambled eggs, his favorite breakfast since childhood, in front of him. "Well, I've been called worse things in my teaching career. Remember when your class nicknamed me the grammar guillotine? That earned me a small smile, the first I'd seen since the church. Because you mercilessly executed run-on sentences." He pushed the eggs around his plate. "Mom, what if they're right? What if I'm just someone who's easy to fool? Easy to betray?" I sat down across from him, my heart aching at the doubt in his voice. "James Thomas Sullivan, look at me." I waited until he met my eyes. "Being betrayed doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. Being able to trust, to love openly. Those aren't weaknesses. They're your father's best qualities that live on in you." The mention of Thomas seemed to steady him. Dad would have liked Charlotte at first, wouldn't he? He always saw the best in people. "Yes, he would have," I agreed. "But he also would have seen through her eventually. Your father had an uncanny ability to spot authenticity, or the lack of it. It's partly why he was such a successful defense attorney. He could tell when clients were lying to him." James pushed his plate away, suddenly restless. "I need to go to the apartment today. Get some clothes, my laptop. Charlotte texted that she'll be at her mother's until Wednesday." "I'll come with you," I offered, then quickly added, "Or I can wait in the car if you'd rather do it alone." He considered for a moment. "No, come up with me. I don't trust myself not to listen if she shows up and tries to explain again." The apartment was exactly as they'd left it the morning of the wedding. Charlotte's makeup was still scattered. Across the bathroom counter, her wedding day robe draped over a chair. The sight of it made James pause in the doorway, his hands clenching into fists. "She was standing right there," he said quietly, "practicing her vows in the mirror while I made coffee. Talking about our future, our plans for children, the house we were going to buy in Brookline, all while she was—" He couldn't finish the sentence. I moved through the apartment efficiently, gathering his essential items while he stood in the living room, looking lost among the carefully curated furniture and artwork that Charlotte had selected. Everything in the space spoke of her influence. The minimalist decor, the abstract paintings, the uncomfortable-looking modern sofa that had replaced his beloved leather recliner. "Your father's watch," I remembered suddenly. "The one he left you? Is it here?" James's eyes widened. "In the bedroom safe. Charlotte insisted we keep all valuable jewelry locked up after that break-in at her friend's place. We found the watch along with other items that were purely James's, his grandfather's cufflinks, the first dollar he'd earned from his summer job, the small box of letters I'd written him when he was at college. As he packed these personal treasures, I noticed other things missing. Photos of our family had been gradually removed from the walls, replaced by Charlotte's preferred artistic prints. His collection of architectural books had been relegated to a bottom shelf, while Charlotte's self-help and business strategy books dominated the prime eye-level spaces. "She really did erase me, didn't she?" James said, looking around with new eyes. "Not just from the wedding, but from everything. It was so gradual I didn't even notice." Before I could respond, we heard keys in the door. Charlotte walked in, stopping short when she saw us. She looked different from the bride I'd confronted. Smaller somehow, without her carefully constructed armor of designer clothes and perfect makeup. "James," she breathed, taking a step forward. "I've been trying to call you. If you'd just let me explain." "Don't." James's voice was firm. "There's nothing to explain. The photos explained enough. The texts explained enough. The receipts explained enough." Those things don't tell the whole story," she pleaded. "Daniel and I... It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. But what you and I have is real. We can work through this. Go to counseling. Rebuild trust. Your mother has poisoned your mind. Against me, but if you just stop..." James held up a hand. "Just stop. You don't get to blame my mother for this. She showed me the truth. You're the one who lied. You're the one who cheated. You're the one who planned to divorce me and take half of everything I've worked for." Charlotte's face crumpled. "That was Daniel's idea. He was jealous, pushing for more than I wanted to give. I never would have gone through with it. I love you, James. Only you." I watched my son straighten his shoulders, channeling his father's courtroom presence. "You know what's interesting, Charlotte? For the first time in 2 years, I can hear your words clearly. No manipulation, no gaslighting, no subtle digs or carefully crafted guilt trips. Just desperate lies from someone who got caught." She turned to me then, eyes blazing. "This is all your fault. You couldn't stand seeing him, happy with someone else. You couldn't stand not being the most important woman in his life. You're pathetic, clinging to your adult son because you never got over your husband's death." "That's enough." James's voice cracked like a whip. "You don't get to speak to my mother that way. Not ever again. She protected me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Which is more than I can say for anyone else who claimed to love me." Charlotte tried one more time, reaching for him with trembling hands. "Baby, please. We can start over. I'll cut ties with Daniel. I'll go to therapy. I'll do whatever it takes. Don't throw away everything we built because of one mistake." "One mistake?" James laughed bitterly. "Was it one mistake when you slowly isolated me from my family? One mistake when you manipulated me into doubting every relationship I had? One mistake when you planned your exit strategy with my friend? No, Charlotte. This wasn't one mistake. This was who you are." He turned to me. "Mom, can you take this box down to the car? I need a moment to pack the rest of my things." I understood what he wasn't saying. He needed to have this final conversation alone. As I left with the box of his treasured possessions, I heard Charlotte begin to cry. But her sobs sounded hollow, performative, like everything else about her had been. 20 minutes later, James emerged from the building with 2 suitcases and his laptop bag. He looked drained, but somehow lighter, as if setting down a heavy burden he'd carried too long. We drove home in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind we used to share on long car rides when he was younger. The next few days fell into a strange new rhythm. James worked remotely from my dining room table, fielding endless calls from concerned clients and colleagues. I kept busy in the garden, giving him space while staying close enough if he needed me. Every few hours I'd bring him coffee or tea, sometimes catching him staring at old family photos on the walls with a thoughtful expression. Pat came by regularly, bringing casseroles and updates from her legal firm's grapevine. Daniel's wife had filed for divorce and was going after everything, including his partnership shares in the architectural firm where he and James had worked together. Charlotte had been placed on indefinite leave from her marketing executive position after several clients threatened to pull their accounts over the scandal. The karma train arrives right on schedule. Pat commented one evening as we sat on the back porch, watching James work on his laptop. "Helen Winters must be having fits. All those society connections she worked so hard to cultivate. All those country club memberships. And now her daughter's the talk of every gossip circle in Boston." I thought about Helen's threat outside the church. "You'll pay for this." But the truth had its own currency, and the price was being paid by those who had dealt in lies. A week after the non-wedding, James received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Chen, his childhood friend who lived next door, stopped by with a box of his old things she'd found while cleaning her parents' attic. They spent hours going through childhood memorabilia, their laughter drifting through the open windows as they rediscovered shared memories Charlotte had tried to make him doubt. "Remember when we built that tree house?" Sarah asked, holding up a faded Polaroid. "Your mom helped us design it, and your dad taught us about load-bearing branches. We thought we were going to be architects together." "Well, one of us made it." James smiled. "How's the therapy practice going?" They talked until sunset, and I pretended not to notice the way Sarah's presence seemed to ease some of the tension from James's shoulders. Some connections, I realized, were too deep for even Charlotte's manipulation to completely sever. That night, as I was preparing for bed, I heard a knock on my door. James stood there looking young and vulnerable in his old Red Sox t-shirt. "Can we talk?" I patted the bed beside me, and he sat down, reminding me of countless late-night conversations during his teenage years. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about what Charlotte said," he began slowly. "About you not getting over Dad's death. About clinging to me." My heart clenched, but I stayed quiet, letting him find his words. "The thing is," he continued, "I never saw it that way. After Dad died, you didn't cling to me. You lifted me up. You made sure I knew I was loved, but you also made sure I became my own person. You supported my dreams, even when they scared you. Remember when I wanted to study abroad in Japan? You were terrified of me being so far away, but you helped me apply for scholarships anyway." Tears pricked at my eyes as I remembered that difficult goodbye at Logan Airport, watching my 16-year-old son embark on his first real adventure without me. "Charlotte tried to make me see that support as control," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "She twisted every memory, every interaction, until I couldn't trust my own experiences. But sitting here, in this house, with these photos and memories, I'm remembering the truth. And the truth is, you've always known when to hold on and when to let go." I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "That's what real love is, honey. It's not about possession or control. It's about wanting the best for someone, even when that means watching them walk their own path. Even when that path leads them straight into a wall?" he asked with a self-deprecating smile. "Especially then," I replied. "Because that's when they need to know they have a safe place to land, and someone who will help them get back up." James was quiet for a moment, looking around my room at the familiar decorations. The quilt his grandmother had made, the photograph of Thomas holding him as a baby, the dried flowers from my wedding bouquet I'd preserved in a shadow box. "I want to start over," he said finally. "Not just with work or relationships, but with understanding myself. Dr. Morrison, she's still your therapist, right? Do you think she'd take me on as a client?" "I'm sure she would," I said carefully. "But there are other excellent therapists. If you'd be more comfortable with someone who doesn't know me," he shook his head. "No, I think it would be good to work with someone who understands our family dynamics. Someone who can help me see where I lost myself and how to find my way back." As he stood to leave, he paused in the doorway. "Mom, thank you. Not just for the wedding day, but for everything. For being the kind of mother who would risk her relationship with her son to protect him from making a terrible mistake." After he left, I sat for a long time looking at the photograph of Thomas with baby James. "You'd be proud of him," I whispered to my late husband's smiling image. He's finding his way back to himself. The next morning, I found James and Sarah in the kitchen, attempting to recreate the pancake recipe they'd perfected during their childhood sleepovers. The kitchen was a disaster, but their laughter was real and healing. As I watched them from the doorway, I thought about new beginnings and second chances, about the way life sometimes tears things apart so they can be rebuilt stronger. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be legal matters to settle, professional relationships to rebuild, emotional wounds to heal. But watching my son flip a slightly burned pancake while his oldest friend teased him about his cooking skills, I knew we would get through it together. Because sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one. 3 weeks after the wedding that never was, life had settled into an unexpected new normal. James had officially moved back home, converting my home office into a temporary architectural studio. The dining room table became command central for what he called Operation Phoenix, his systematic plan to rebuild both his personal and professional life from the ashes of Charlotte's betrayal. I was in the garden one morning, deadheading roses while contemplating how life's most significant changes often arrive disguised as disasters, when I heard the distinctive sound of Helen Winter's Mercedes pulling into our driveway. My hands tightened around the pruning shears as I watched her emerge, impeccably dressed in a Chanel suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Mrs. Sullivan," she called out, picking her way across the lawn in inappropriate heels. "We need to talk about damage control." I continued trimming my roses, forcing her to come to me. "Damage control? Interesting choice of words, Helen. I would have thought damage was what your daughter and Daniel Hayes did to my son." She waved away my words like annoying insects. What's done is done. The question now is how we handle this situation like civilized people. Charlotte is willing to be generous in the settlement if James agrees to sign an NDA about the unfortunate circumstances of their separation. I finally turned to face her, noting how her perfectly arranged facade showed tiny cracks of desperation around the edges. "That's not my decision to make. James is an adult, and he'll handle the legal aspects of this situation as he sees fit." "Oh, please," Helen scoffed. "We both know you're the puppet master here. You orchestrated this whole drama because you couldn't stand the thought of sharing your son with someone else. Well, congratulations. You won. But now it's time to think about damage limitation." Before I could respond, James's voice cut through the morning air. "Actually, Helen, my mother didn't orchestrate anything. Your daughter and my former best friend did that all on their own." He walked across the lawn to join us, looking every inch his father's son in his crisp business casual attire. "And I'm not interested in signing any NDAs." Helen's expression tightened. "Be reasonable, James. This situation is affecting both our families' reputations. Charlotte's career." "Charlotte's career?" James interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "You mean the executive position she got through your country club connections? The one she used to facilitate her affair with my friend? That career?" "You're angry. I understand that." Helen pressed on. "But surely we can handle this discreetly, for everyone's sake." I watched my son straighten his shoulders, channeling the quiet strength that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of Charlotte's manipulation. "No, Helen, I don't think we can. You see, I've spent the past 3 weeks in therapy, understanding how your daughter systematically isolated me from everyone who truly cared about me. How she used your social connections and influence to remake me into someone I didn't recognize. I'm done being discreet." Helen's face flushed. "Are you threatening us?" "Not at all. James replied calmly. "I'm simply declining to help cover up the truth. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with my lawyers about dissolving the partnership with Daniel's firm." After Helen stormed, off in her expensive heels, James turned to me with a slight smile. "You know, a month ago, I would have given in to her demands. Charlotte always said I needed to be more socially strategic. I resumed pruning my roses. And now I understand that socially strategic was just code for easily manipulated." He picked up a fallen rose petal, twirling it between his fingers. "Dr. Morrison helped me see how many of my decisions over the past 2 years weren't really mine at all. The therapy sessions had indeed been revelatory. Dr. Morrison, with her gentle but incisive approach, had helped James unpack the layers of manipulation that had characterized his relationship with Charlotte. Each session revealed new insights into how thoroughly he had been coached to doubt his own instincts and memories. "She had me convinced that my childhood was dysfunctional," James continued, helping me gather the pruned stems. "That your devotion to me after Dad died was somehow unhealthy. But you know what I realized? She was jealous of any relationship she couldn't control." The sound of a car door closing drew our attention. Sarah Chen was walking up the driveway, carrying what looked like architectural drawings. Since that first evening of shared memories, she had become a regular presence in our home, helping James with the practical aspects of establishing his own firm. "Hope I'm not interrupting," she called out, her practical sneakers a stark contrast to Helen's designer heels. "But I think I found the perfect office space in that old Victorian on Maple Street, the one with all the original woodwork." James's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm, something I hadn't seen during his entire relationship with Charlotte. "The Henderson House. I love that building. But I thought it was off the market." "It was," Sarah grinned, "until I mentioned to my aunt on the Historical Preservation Board that a certain talented architect might be interested in restoring it properly. I gathered my gardening tools, preparing to give them space to discuss business. But James stopped me. "Mom, stay. I'd like your input on this. Remember how you used to help me with my architecture homework? All those conversations about preserving the soul of old buildings while making them functional for modern life." Sarah spread the drawings out on the garden table, weighing down the corners with smooth river stones from my flower beds. The three of us spent the next hour discussing renovation possibilities, our conversation flowing naturally between professional considerations and personal memories. "Remember when we used to ride our bikes past this house?" Sarah asked, pointing to a particular architectural detail. "You always said you'd restore it someday." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Charlotte hated old buildings, said they were impractical, too expensive to maintain. She wanted us to buy one of those new luxury condos downtown. Well," Sarah said carefully, "maybe some people can't see the value in things that have a history, that tell a story." The way James looked at her then, as if seeing something new in something familiar, reminded me of how Thomas used to look at me across crowded rooms. Some connections, I thought, grow stronger for having been tested by time and distance. Later that afternoon, as Sarah was leaving, she paused by my rose garden. "These are beautiful, Mrs. Sullivan. My mom says you've always had a gift for helping things grow." I smiled, understanding she wasn't just talking about flowers. "Sometimes the most beautiful blooms come from careful pruning, Sarah. And please, after 30 years, I think you can call me Maggie." The next few weeks brought more changes. James found temporary office space while the Victorian underwent initial inspections. His decision to leave the firm he'd built with Daniel was painful but necessary, and several loyal clients followed him. The legal proceedings for dissolving the partnership were complicated by Daniel's concurrent divorce, but James remained steadfast in his determination to make a clean break. Charlotte made several more attempts to contact him, each more desperate than the last. The final straw came when she showed up at our door late one night, clearly drunk, alternating between tears and accusations. "You've ruined everything," she sobbed, mascara running down her face. "Both of you. I had it all planned perfectly. The marriage, the connections, the future. Do you know what it's like to watch everything you've worked for slip away?" "Worked for?" James's voice was tired but firm. "You mean manipulated for? Lied for? Cheated for?" "Yes, Charlotte, I know exactly what that feels like, because I watched 2 years of my life slip away while you and Daniel played me for a fool." She turned to me then, her designer dress wrinkled and wine-stained. "This is your fault. You just couldn't let him go, could you? Had to keep him tied to your apron strings. No wonder he was so easy to manipulate. You trained him to be dependent. That's enough." James stepped between us. "You don't get to rewrite history anymore, Charlotte. My mother taught me to be strong, independent, and honest. Everything you tried to unmake me into. Now please, leave before I call the police." After she left, James and I sat in the kitchen drinking tea, the way we had through so many difficult moments in our lives. "You know what's strange?" he said, staring into his cup. "I feel sorry for her." "Why's that?" "Because she'll never understand real love, the kind that lets you be yourself, that supports without suffocating, that tells hard truths instead of comfortable lies." He looked up at me. "The kind you and Dad showed me." The mention of Thomas made me smile. "Your father would be proud of how you're handling all this. He always said the measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in how they get back up." "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately," James admitted. "About how he always seemed to know who he was, what he stood for. I lost that somewhere, along the way with Charlotte, but I'm finding it again. Part of that finding involved reconnecting with old friends and colleagues who had been gradually pushed out of his life. Sarah's presence became increasingly regular, her practical wisdom and shared history providing a grounding influence as James rebuilt his professional identity. I watched their relationship evolve with quiet satisfaction, noting how naturally they worked together, how their shared laughter filled the house with a warmth that Charlotte's calculated perfection had never achieved. They weren't dating. Both were too wise and had been through too much to rush into anything. But there was a comfortable intimacy in their interaction that spoke of deep understanding. One evening, I overheard them talking on the back porch, their voices carrying through the open kitchen window as I prepared dinner. "I never liked her, you know," Sarah was saying, "even before everything happened. Something about her felt rehearsed." "Why didn't you tell me?" James asked. No accusation in his voice, just curiosity. "Would you have believed me? You were so in love with the idea of her, the perfect life she represented. Sometimes people have to discover truth for themselves." There was a long pause before James spoke again. "You know what I'm most ashamed of? Not the fact that I was fooled, but that I let her make me doubt the real relationships in my life. With Mom, with you, with everyone who actually cared about me." "Hey!" Sarah's voice was gentle. "You're not the first person to be taken in by someone who knew exactly what buttons to push. The important thing is that you found your way back." Their conversation drifted to other topics, but I stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, thinking about paths lost and found, about the way life sometimes brings us full circle to where we need to be. The next morning, I found James in his father's old study, looking through photo albums I'd carefully preserved over the years. "Mom," he called out when he saw me. "Come look at this." The photograph he held showed him and Sarah at their high school graduation, both beaming at the camera with the unshakable confidence of youth. Thomas and I stood behind them, and I remembered how proud he had been that day, watching our son prepare to chase his dreams. "Dad gave me advice that day," James said softly. He said, "Son, success isn't about reaching a destination. It's about being true to yourself along the journey." I forgot that somewhere along the way with Charlotte. She made everything about appearances, about reaching the right positions, knowing the right people. I sat beside him, looking at my late husband's smiling face in the photograph. Your father never cared about any of that. He took cases based on whether he believed in them, not on how much they paid or what connections they offered. That's why people trusted him. That's what I want for my new firm, James said with sudden conviction. Not just to design beautiful buildings, but to create spaces that matter, that have integrity. Sarah understands that. She's helping me remember who I wanted to be before Charlotte convinced me I needed to be someone else. The mention of Sarah brought a slight flush to his cheeks, and I hid my smile. Some things a mother notices but knows better than to mention. As summer deepened into autumn, the changes in James became more pronounced. He stood straighter, laughed more freely, spoke with increasing confidence about his plans for the future. The Victorian on Maple Street was slowly transforming under his vision, much like he was transforming under the gentle influence of truth and authentic relationships. Charlotte's influence faded like a bad dream, though occasional reminders surfaced. A wedding gift would arrive from someone who hadn't heard the news, or a social media memory would pop up showing happier times. But these moments no longer carried the sting they once had. "You know what I realized?" James said one evening as we worked together in the garden preparing it for winter. "Charlotte never really loved me. She loved the idea of me, the successful architect, the society husband, the carefully crafted image. But she never knew the real me at all." I thought about how Thomas would have responded to that insight. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "the people who can't love us for who we are show us exactly why we need to love ourselves more." James nodded, understanding flowing between us as naturally as it had when he was small and coming to me with scraped knees and broken toys. Some bonds, I realized, can't be broken by manipulation or lies. They only grow stronger when tested, like plants that develop deeper roots in response to strong winds. The sun was setting behind the old maple trees, casting long shadows across our yard. In the distance, I could hear Sarah's car pulling into the driveway, probably bringing more renovation plans or maybe just coming to share another evening of healing conversation. Life wasn't perfect. There were still legal battles to fight, professional relationships to rebuild, emotional wounds to heal. But watching my son straighten up to greet his oldest friend, his face lighting up with genuine joy, I knew we had turned a corner. Sometimes the hardest truths lead us to our best possibilities. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, bearing the return address of Thomas's old law firm. I almost missed it among the usual bills and junk mail, but something about the heavy cream-colored paper caught my attention. Inside was a letter that would shatter the fragile peace we'd built over the past 2 months. "Dear Mrs. Sullivan," it began in formal typeface. "In light of recent events concerning your son James Sullivan and his terminated engagement, We are legally obligated to inform you of certain documents in our possession, held in trust by your late husband, Thomas Sullivan. My hands trembled as I read further. Thomas, my Thomas, had known something about Charlotte's family, long before she entered our lives. He had kept a sealed file with explicit instructions that it should only be opened if James ever became romantically involved with anyone connected to the Winters family. I sat heavily in my kitchen chair, the morning light suddenly too harsh. Thomas had been dead for 25 years. How could he have known? What could he possibly have discovered about Helen Winters that warranted such specific instructions? Mom? James's voice startled me. He stood in the doorway, concern etching his features. You look like you've seen a ghost, in a way I had. We need to go to your father's old firm, I said, my voice barely steady. There's something we have to see. The drive downtown was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. The law office had changed names 3 times since Thomas's death, but they'd maintained his files with professional courtesy. The managing partner, Gregory Matthews, had been a junior associate when Thomas was alive. I remember when he left these instructions, Gregory said, placing a thick manila envelope on his desk. It was one of the last cases he worked on before the accident. He was troubled by what he'd discovered. James reached for the envelope, but Gregory held up a hand. Before you open this, you should know your father was investigating a series of corporate fraud cases. One of them involved Helen Winters' first husband, Charlotte's biological father. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Helen had always claimed Charlotte's father died when she was an infant. It was part of their carefully curated family history, like everything else about the Winters' public image. With trembling fingers, James opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, bank statements, and court documents dating back to 1990. They told a story so different from the one we knew that it took my breath away. Charlotte's father hadn't died. He'd gone to prison for orchestrating a massive investment fraud that had ruined hundreds of families. Helen had changed their names and moved to Boston, reinventing herself as Old Money Society while her husband served his sentence. The victims were never repaid. There's more, Gregory said quietly. Thomas discovered that Helen had been complicit in the fraud. She avoided prosecution by testifying against her husband, but she kept millions in hidden accounts. That's how she maintained their lifestyle, paid for Charlotte's education, built their social connections. James was reading through the documents, his face growing paler by the minute. The trust fund Charlotte claimed she had, the connections she used to get her executive position, it was all stolen money? Yes, Gregory confirmed. Your father was building a case to recover the funds for the victims when he died. The investigation was quietly closed afterward. Helen had powerful friends by then. I remembered Thomas's distraction in those final weeks, the late nights he spent in his study. Had he known his time was running out? Had he left these instructions knowing that someday, somehow, our paths would cross with the Winters family? There's a letter, Gregory added, pulling out a sealed envelope with my name on it, in Thomas's familiar handwriting. He left this with specific instructions that it should only be opened under these exact circumstances. My hand shook as I broke the seal, and suddenly my late husband's voice seemed to fill the room. My dearest Winnie, if you're reading this, our son has had a close encounter with the Winters family. I pray my suspicions were wrong, that these documents never needed to see the light of day. But I knew Helen Winters, knew the kind of person she was, the kind of daughter she would raise. The money they stole didn't just represent dollars and cents. It was people's lives, their futures, their children's education funds. I couldn't prove Helen's involvement in time, but I gathered everything here, hoping it might protect our family someday. Tell James I'm sorry I couldn't be there to warn him in person, but remember what I always said. The truth, however painful, is better than the most comfortable lie. All my love, Thomas. James sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that his almost mother-in-law was a fraud conspirator, that the family's wealth and social standing were built on stolen dreams. But it was the next document that truly shook him. Charlotte knew. He whispered, holding up a bank statement. Look at these transfers. She's been accessing one of the hidden accounts for years. She's not just Helen's victim or unwitting beneficiary. She's actively involved in hiding the stolen money. Suddenly, Charlotte's insistence on a prenuptial agreement, her careful manipulation of James's business connections, her push for him to merge his firm with larger corporate interests. It all made terrible sense. She hadn't just been planning to divorce him. She'd been positioning him to unknowingly help launder her family's illegal fortune. That's why she was so desperate to keep everything quiet after the wedding, I realized. An investigation into her relationship with Daniel could have exposed everything. James stood abruptly, his father's sense of justice blazing in his eyes. We have to turn this over to the authorities. Those families deserve to know the truth. They deserve their money back. Gregory nodded gravely. I'll contact the FBI's white-collar crime division. They've been trying to trace these funds for years. This could finally give them what they need. As we left the office, James was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. All this time, I thought, I was the victim of a simple affair, of Charlotte's social climbing. But it was so much bigger than that. Dad knew. Somehow he knew I'd need this truth someday. I reached for his hand, marveling at how Thomas's love and integrity had reached through time to protect our son. Your father believed that the truth always finds its way to the surface. Sometimes it just needs a little help. The implications of what we'd discovered would take weeks to fully unfold. But as we drove home, I couldn't help but think that sometimes the worst betrayals lead us to the most important truths. And somewhere, I was sure, Thomas was watching over us still. The next 48 hours moved with the strange intensity of a gathering storm. FBI agents came and went from our home, collecting documents and taking statements. James spent hours on conference calls with federal prosecutors, unraveling the complex web of financial transactions that had nearly entangled him. Through it all, I watched my son transform from a victim of betrayal into something his father would have been proud of. An advocate for justice. They're moving tonight, James told me as we sat in our kitchen, the autumn rain tapping against the windows. The FBI is executing search warrants at Helen's house, Charlotte's apartment, and their vacation properties. They want us to stay, here where it's safe. I could hear the tension in his voice, see the way his hands gripped his coffee mug too tightly. Are you sure you want to be here? We could go to Pat's house or... No. He cut me off firmly. I need to be here, in Dad's house, where it all started. Sarah arrived just before dusk, carrying files from the Historical Preservation Board. I've been going through old records, she explained, spreading papers across our kitchen table. The Winters family's corruption goes deeper than we thought. They've been using historical properties to launder money for years, buying them through shell companies, inflating renovation costs, selling them at suspicious profits. James leaned over the documents, his architect's eye catching detail others might miss. These renovation budgets, they're impossible. No one spends this much on basic repairs unless they're hiding money, Sarah finished. Your father was investigating one of these properties when he died. The old Marshall estate on Beacon Hill. The name hit me like a physical blow. Thomas had mentioned the Marshall estate in those final weeks, had seemed troubled by something he'd discovered about its sale. Had that discovery led to his accident? The question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with possibility. My phone buzzed. Pat, texting from her law firm downtown. Helen Winters just walked into our office. She's demanding to speak with the senior partners. She looks desperate. As if on cue, James's phone lit up with Charlotte's number. He let it go to voicemail, his jaw tight. Moments later, a text appeared. "Please, James. I can explain everything. Mom's losing it. I need your help. For what we had, please. She's scared." Sarah observed quietly. "They both are. Their whole world is about to collapse." James stood abruptly, pacing the kitchen like his father used to do when wrestling with a difficult case. All those families they destroyed. Dad tried to help them. He knew what Helen had done, knew what Charlotte would become. And I almost... "But you didn't?" I reminded him gently. "Your father made sure of that." The doorbell rang, making us all jump. Through the rain-streaked window, I could see 2 FBI agents on our porch, their faces grave. James let them in, water dripping from their overcoats onto our hardwood floors. "We have a situation," Agent Martinez said without preamble. "Helen Winters is threatening to release sensitive information about several federal judges unless we back off. She's cornered, and cornered people do desperate things." "What kind of information?" James asked. "The kind that could destroy careers, families. She's been collecting dirt on powerful people for decades, using it as insurance. But now she's ready to burn it all down." Sarah finished. Agent Martinez nodded. "We need your help, Mr. Sullivan. Helen's asking for a meeting. You, her, and Charlotte. She claims she has information about your father's accident that you'll want to hear." The room went still. James looked at me, his eyes filled with the same question that had haunted me for 25 years. Had Thomas's death really been an accident? "It's a trap," Sarah said immediately. "They're desperate. They'll say anything to get leverage." "Maybe," James agreed. "But what if it's not? What if they really know something about Dad?" I stood up, my decision made. "Then we face it together. Thomas wouldn't want us to hide from the truth, no matter how painful it might be." Agent Martinez shook her head. "Mrs. Sullivan, it's too risky. Helen Winters is unpredictable right now. We can't guarantee your safety." "My husband died trying to expose their crimes," I said firmly. "I won't let my son face them alone." James reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "The meeting." He told Agent Martinez. "Where and when?" 1 hour. The Marshall estate on Beacon Hill. Helen insisted on the location. Of course she did. The house where it all began, where Thomas had discovered whatever secret had led to his death. The symmetry was either poetic or terrifying. Sarah grabbed her car keys. "I'm coming, too. I have the current access codes to the property through the Preservation Board. You'll need them." As we prepared to leave, I went to Thomas's study and opened his old safe. Inside was his service revolver, untouched since his death. After a moment's hesitation, I took it out and put it in my purse. Something told me we might need every advantage we could get. The rain had intensified as we pulled up to the Marshall estate, its Victorian grandeur looming against the darkening sky. FBI vehicles were parked discreetly along the street, agents waiting in the shadows. Through the iron gates, I could see lights on in the main house. "Whatever happens in there," James said quietly, We face it together. For Dad. I nodded, unable to speak. Sarah squeezed his arm supportively, then moved to enter the security code at the gate. As it swung open with a ghostly creak, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into more than just a confrontation. We were walking into the past itself, where 25 years of secrets waited to be unveiled. The Marshall Estate's grand foyer was exactly as Thomas had described it, in his case notes. Marble floors, mahogany paneling, and a sweeping staircase that seemed to float upward into darkness. Helen Winters stood at its base, her usual polish cracked by desperation. Charlotte hovered nearby, looking small and afraid in a way I'd never seen before. "James." Charlotte stepped forward, but stopped when he raised his hand. "Don't," he said quietly. "Just tell us what you know about my father." Helen's laugh was brittle. "Always straight to business, just like Thomas. He couldn't leave well enough alone either. Had to keep digging, keep pushing, until..." "Until what?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the vast space. "Until his car mysteriously crashed on a clear night? Until all his files about your fraud disappeared?" "Mom," James warned softly. But I couldn't stop. "Did you kill my husband, Helen? Did you arrange his accident to protect your stolen fortune?" Helen's face twisted. "I didn't kill Thomas Sullivan, but I know who did." She looked at Charlotte, something unspoken passing between them. "Show them." Charlotte moved to an antique desk, pulling out a thick folder. "This house," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't just about money laundering. The basement. There are records down there. Records of everything." "My first husband," Helen continued. "Charlotte's father. He didn't just steal money. He created an entire underground network for wealthy criminals to hide their assets. This house was the center of it all. Thomas found out, but he didn't know how deep it went. How many powerful people were involved." James took the folder, his hand steady even as his world shifted again. "And one of these people arranged Dad's accident." "A federal judge," Charlotte whispered. "He's still on the bench. When Thomas threatened to expose everything..." The sound of footsteps above us cut through the tension. Sarah, who had been checking the security system, rushed back into the foyer. "We've got company. Someone's disabled the FBI's surveillance." Suddenly, the lights went out. In the darkness, I heard Helen's sharp intake of breath. "He's here. He must have known we'd come tonight." "Who's here?" James demanded. "Judge Malcolm Reynolds." Helen's voice shook. "He's the one who ordered the hit on your father, and now he's come to clean up his mess." The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the judge's face at the top of the stairs. He looked exactly as he did in his courthouse. Photos. Distinguished, authoritative, and utterly cold. "Helen," he called down, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "I'm disappointed. We had an arrangement." "The arrangement was to keep quiet," Helen shot back. "Not to watch you destroy more lives." The judge descended slowly, his footsteps measured. "Thomas Sullivan was a good man. Too good. He wouldn't understand that sometimes justice needs to be flexible." He reached into his jacket. "Now, I'm afraid we have another mess to clean up." The gun in his hand gleamed in the dim light. I reached for my purse, feeling Thomas's revolver, but James stepped forward. "My father," he said clearly, "spent his life fighting for real justice, not your twisted version of it." "Your father was naive," Reynolds replied. "Just like you're being naive now. Those documents won't help you. One phone call and they'll disappear, just like all the evidence against Helen did 25 years ago. Except for one thing. Sarah's voice rang out from the shadows. She held up her phone. Everything you just said has been live streaming to the FBI's secure server, and to the State Bar Association, and to every major news outlet in Boston. The judge's composure cracked. His gun swung toward Sarah, but James was faster. He tackled Reynolds just as a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the wooden paneling behind us. The gun skittered across the marble floor, stopping at my feet. I picked it up with shaking hands, pointing it at Reynolds as James pinned him down. Charlotte stood frozen, watching her carefully constructed world crumble, while Helen sank to her knees, decades of secrets finally breaking her. The FBI burst in moments later, agents swarming the house. As they led Reynolds away in handcuffs, he turned to James. "You're just like your father. He didn't understand either. Some truths are better left buried." "No," James replied firmly. "Some truths need to be brought into the light. That's what Dad died for, and that's what we're going to do with every piece of evidence in this house." The agents collected the documents and secured the scene. Charlotte approached James one last time. "I did love you," she said softly. "In my way. But I've been trapped in this web of lies my entire life. I don't know how to live any other way." James looked at her with a mixture of pity and resolution. "Then maybe it's time you learned. Starting with telling the truth about everything you know." She nodded slowly, then turned to follow an agent who would take her statement. Helen went quietly too, her shoulders bowed under the weight of 25 years of deception. In the aftermath, James, Sarah, and I stood in the foyer where Thomas had once stood, where he had discovered the truth that would cost him his life. But his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. His son had finished what he started, had brought justice to those who thought themselves above the law. "Dad would be proud," James said quietly, looking around the grand house that had held so many secrets. "Not just of exposing them, but of doing it the right way." Sarah took his hand. "He's been proud all along. Everything he left behind, the evidence, the letter, the warnings, it was all because he believed in you." I touched the wooden paneling where Thomas had once traced, the hidden compartments holding evidence of corruption. "He believed in justice," I said softly. "And now, finally, it's been served." Outside, the rain had stopped. Dawn was breaking over Boston, painting the sky in shades of hope. Sometimes I realized the greatest acts of love are the truths we leave behind for others to find. 1 year later, I stood in my garden, watching the autumn sunlight paint shadows across my roses. The morning paper lay on the kitchen table, its headline announcing Judge Reynolds' sentencing. 25 years to life for Thomas's murder, along with additional charges for corruption and obstruction of justice. Helen Winters had received 15 years for her role in the financial crimes, while Charlotte, in exchange for her full cooperation, was serving 5 years in a minimum security facility. The Marshall estate had yielded even more secrets than we'd imagined, decades of financial records that helped federal prosecutors recover millions in stolen assets. The money was being returned to the families who had lost everything, their lives finally gaining a measure of justice Thomas had died trying to secure. James emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked different now, stronger, more centered, his father's quiet confidence evident in his bearing. The architectural firm he'd built from the ashes of his old life was thriving, specializing in restoring historical properties with transparency and integrity. "The Victorian on Maple Street opens next week," he said, handing me a cup. The Restoration Board is calling it a model of historical preservation done right. I smiled, remembering the building's transformation from a neglected shell to a vibrant community space. Your father would have loved seeing what you've done with it. We're dedicating the legal aid clinic in the East Wing to him, James added, softly. A place where people can get help fighting for justice, regardless of their means. Sarah's aunt on the preservation board thinks it's perfect. The mention of Sarah brought a gentle warmth to his voice. Their relationship had evolved naturally over the past year, built on a foundation of shared history and mutual understanding. She'd been his rock through the trials and revelations, her practical wisdom helping him navigate the aftermath of Charlotte's betrayal and the discovery of his father's murderer. Speaking of Sarah, I ventured carefully, I noticed she left her preservation books here again. James's smile was soft. Actually, we've been talking about that. About a lot of things. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. I wanted you to be the first to see this. Inside was his grandmother's ring, not the ostentatious diamond Charlotte had demanded, but the vintage sapphire that had been in our family for generations. It's perfect, I said, my voice thick with emotion. She'll love it. I'm doing it right this time, he said firmly. No rush, no grand gestures, no society expectations. Just truth and love and building something real together. Pat joined us for dinner that evening, bringing a bottle of wine and the latest updates from the legal community. The repercussions of the Marshall Estate revelations were still rippling through Boston's power structures, exposing decades of corruption and forcing long-overdue changes. You'll never guess who I saw today, she said, accepting a glass of wine. Daniel Hayes. He's working as a junior architect at a small firm in New Hampshire. Apparently, the divorce took everything, and none of the big firms would touch him after the scandal. James absorbed this information quietly. I hope he finds his way back to who he really is, he said finally. That's the thing about truth. It strips away everything false until you have to face yourself. Later, as Pat and I cleaned up the kitchen, she watched James in the garden with Sarah, who had arrived for their evening walk. You know, Pat said thoughtfully, sometimes the worst betrayals lead us to our best possibilities. Look at him now. He's more himself than he ever was with Charlotte. I thought about Thomas, about the legacy of truth he'd left for our son. He knew, I said softly. Somehow, Thomas knew that James would need those documents someday. Not just to expose the corruption, but to understand the value of integrity. And to find his way back to Sarah, Pat added with a smile. Some connections are just meant to be. The next morning, I found James in Thomas's old study, sorting through case files we'd recovered from the Marshall estate. The FBI had finally released them, and he was donating them to a law school's ethics department as a teaching tool. Mom, he called out, holding up a photograph. Look at this. It was a picture I'd never seen before. Thomas standing in front of the Marshall estate 25 years ago, his expression serious as he examined some document, but it was the background that caught my attention. There, barely visible through a window, was a young Helen Winters, watching him with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew, James said quietly. She knew what would happen to him, but she was too trapped in her own web of lies to stop it. I took the photograph, studying my late husband's face. That's why he left the evidence where he did, protected the way it was. He knew the truth would come out eventually, and he wanted to make sure it came out right. I've been thinking about forgiveness, James said suddenly. Not for Judge Reynolds or even really for Charlotte, but for myself, for not seeing through the lies sooner, for doubting the people who really loved me. I sat beside him, remembering all the times I'd wrestled with forgiveness after Thomas's death. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing. It's about freeing yourself to move forward. That's what Sarah says too. He smiled. She's helping me understand that everything, even the pain and betrayal, led me where I needed to be. The sound of the doorbell interrupted us. Sarah stood on the porch, holding blueprints for their next restoration project. But today, something was different. She practically glowed with excitement. The Historical Society approved our proposal, she announced as soon as we opened the door. They want us to restore the old courthouse on Beacon Hill. All the original, woodwork, the judges' chambers, everything. James caught my eye, and I nodded encouragingly. He took Sarah's hand, leading her to the garden where they had played as children, where they had reconnected after the storm of Charlotte's betrayal, where new beginnings were always possible. I watched from the kitchen window as he got down on one knee, offering not just the family ring, but a future built on truth and trust. Sarah's joy was radiant as she said yes, their embrace silhouetted against the rose garden Thomas had helped me plant so many years ago. Later that evening, as we celebrated with champagne on the back porch, I slipped away to visit Thomas's study one last time. The room still held his presence, in the books he'd loved, the justice he'd sought, the truth he'd protected for our son. "You can rest now, my love," I whispered to his photograph on the desk. "The truth is out, justice is served, and our son is finally exactly where he needs to be." Outside, James and Sarah's laughter mingled with the evening breeze, carrying the promise of new beginnings. Sometimes, I realized, the greatest love stories aren't about grand gestures or perfect moments. They're about the quiet strength of truth, the healing power of time, and the courage to begin again. The roses Thomas and I had planted were blooming one last time before winter, their fragrance drifting through the open window. Life, like gardens, has its seasons of growth and rest, of endings and new beginnings. What matters is tending it with truth, nurturing it with love, and believing in the beauty that can emerge from even the darkest times. As I joined our small family on the porch, watching James and Sarah plan their future with quiet joy, I knew that some stories don't end with dramatic revelations or perfect justice. They end with simple truths, that love endures, that integrity matters, and that sometimes the longest way home is the truest, and in the end, that's all any of us can ask for. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.